What I'd like to do is talk about the past for a very short period of time, the future, and what's new, without getting into any of the technical details because we have literally one of Canada's leading experts sitting right next to me. A little bit daunting. The past. So the context is the Canadian Forces and D&D, and what has happened with cyber and what are future intentions. I'm retired. I do not speak for the CF and D&D, but I often speak about them, which I find personally intriguing and delightful. Some of them don't. Anyways, the past. So let's build on the small case study of Afghanistan, to which you've already been referred this morning. Air, land, sea, support trades, thin blue lines, a stage beyond mechanized warfare, dealing in complex circumstances in faraway lands where the people desperately need not only security, and by the way, security has how many aspects? Are you a member of the Carlisle School, which says 17 or 18 if you want to be picky? Or are you an advocate of 5th generation or 6th generation warfare? What does security mean these days? We're going to cover that in a couple of secs. But the idea of the blue, us, good, fighting the red, them, bad, with free space in between and leveraging whatever technologies we can mass produce and train our people on in a relatively short period of time was almost our circumstances on our initial deployment into Afghanistan. Think about it. A lightly equipped, peacekeeping trained, peace support focused, whole of government neophyte organization going to Kabul, which was essentially advanced peacekeeping with an edge, and then Kandahar, which hurt. It's still hurting. That was just about as hairy as it gets short of the Korean War. Thousands of casualties, they've already been referred to, but a responsive government in which, with a responsive population that was willing to dedicate a whole bunch of resources, both people, time, and money, trying to stop the flood of casualties or at least reduce it to a trickle. In terms of the pre-Afghan war experience, or if I could call it the latest Afghan war experience, IT information technology, really this cyber term and not taken full root, was a tool. A very expensive, fractured tool where D&D enjoyed spending about $1 billion a year on a multiplicity of information technology systems. D&D and CSE, we'll talk about that in a couple of seconds, very costly in terms of manpower, and of course the great game was trying to ensure that there was a commonality of functionality so you could actually get systems to talk to one another. And the intelligence community and the chain of command viewed these systems as really second-level enablers. The concept was either defensive or supporting, and almost no attention was spent to exploitation of the cyber realm, and certainly not to offensive operations. We had assets of which some of you are aware. We have communications research out at Leitrim. Does everyone know about them? Okay, then we just won't talk anymore about them. By the way, they're really good at what they do. I used to be a former owner, and I can attest that they're really, really good at what they do. In the main, though, that was skill sets and leverage with our friends and allies, specifically the Americans, the Brits, and some others in that closed inner circle of information sharing. And we really provided radio direction finding and big ears. In return, we got information from other sources up above, or the cyber networks, the information flows on the web from friends and allies who speak with a slight twang. And you know exactly what I'm talking about. Between the 3-4 of us, you kludged together the information sharing, you ensured that there was equitable balances, and you sent each other people to work in each other's facilities. You sent liaison teams and specific source experts. What happened? Everyone needs a forcing function, and the Afghan war for the Canadian Forces in D&D was very much a forcing function. The forcing function was blood. The response from the nation was, I think, superb. Many lessons were learned the hard way, in a very sanguinary way. But one thing became clear, and that was the previous training for conventional operations or lightly equipped peacekeeping forces wasn't cutting it. Neither was the doctrine, nor the technologies. So all three had to change at once. And what was intriguing was the preeminent role driven by the intelligence requirement in Afghanistan to separate the good from the bad, to minimize collateral damage, to ensure that when you took action, it was surgical, and by the way, you had to have warning, not only in terms of a kinetic activity, but who the enemy were and what they were trying to do in terms of their own information operations. Arrived in Kabul, one of the first tasks suggested to me, because I was the first commander in Kabul, by a bright young lady who happened to command an electronic warfare troop, was that we had to help the Afghans reestablish their cell phone network by building a big tower on top of the central mall in Kabul city. Why do we have to do that? Trust me, sir, you'll be really happy. So a Canadian tower went up. Does anybody know what we did with the flow of information on that tower? Nothing, of course. But it was a really good idea. And that's why wherever the Canadian battle groups would operate, you'd see cell phone towers springing up all behind us, which was to help the local Afghans better communicate. What happens to that information, and how does it link in elsewhere? Well, once again, we're talking about a transition phase between pre-Afghan war, or the pre-latest Afghan war, to what actually happened by around 2010. The term cyber, lots of good, hard thinking taking place in the United States, Great Britain, and Canada as well, on the development of doctrine and how you actually channel the information flows and what does it mean. At the same time, D&D gets more focused on self-defense. And at this point in my little talk, I have to tell you the role, both legal, practical, and moral, of D&D in cyber defense is purely self. So D&D and the CF have no responsibility to defend corporate Canada in terms of the cyber realm, nor any other government institution. That, in part, lies with the Communications Security Establishment. And you're all aware of what CSE does in its real mandate. Are you? Excellent. So we won't talk any more about them. But it's something worth paying a lot of attention to, because a great deal of your tax dollars is spent there, and I would argue it's money well spent. Because the threats, and Raf is going to cover these in a couple of secs in terms of the impacts and the trends, are huge. And the potential lack or resultant lack of confidence that us as citizens may have in information flows which are not secure, like my bank account, can cause me to gravely suspect why it is that I'm investing with stockbroker A or giving my money to bank B. And banks don't like negative information. Neither does D&D and the CF. So what's happened is, once again, going back to the past very quickly, think of it as a series of pre-Afghan war stovepipes forced together by that most chilling of all forcing functions, the shedding of blood. By 2010, we have become much more joint in our approach. The various tribes that share the information flows or manage them are coming together, actually quite nicely. Once again, driven by this penultimate forcing function. Cyber is no longer seen as an adjunct to the information technology grids. It's seen as more than an enabler. There's some talk in the military academic circles by 2009, 2010, where it's actually its own domain, air, land, sea, cyber. I myself don't subscribe to that theory, because the last thing we need is another stovepipe which captures up smaller ones and then, of course, results in an increase in overhead. And if you want to talk about overhead in CF and D&D, you can stay after the discussion and I can bore you for hours on the subject. The fear of loss. The fear of loss of information, of loss of a communications architecture which you need to get the job done, is actually starting to dominate the commanders' discussions around the big boys and girls table. I've been there, sat there for years. And cyber is now treated in the same, if you would, with the same attention to detail that the deployment of multiple thousands of troops overseas is treated because of its potential strategic impact. We've come a long way in 5 or 6 short years. In terms of the future, what does it bring? Of course, it's a question of resources, a question of recognizing and prioritizing where it is you've got to spend your gold, which is getting increasingly scarce. Everybody in the room and everybody in Ottawa had better understand that the government's #1 priority, and I don't speak for them either, is to reduce the deficit. And everyone's going to have to pay a fair share of that, including D&D, the CF. Where do you invest? How do you find the gold to do so? Where do you find the skill sets, the equipment, and the cutting-edge technologies and doctrine to actually get the job done? Because it's really expensive. And the answer is, more often than not, we're going to have to find it from within, which leads to a requirement to change dramatically what we're doing now. Because a cyber response team that can track information flows may involve 15, 20, 30 people, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, depending on the volume and where it's located. And there's a variety of such teams around Ottawa doing a variety of things. But it's not nearly as expensive as where we have traditionally spent the scarce D&D dollars in the past. So growth areas for the CF and D&D probably start with #1, the cyber realm, because it has national strategic importance. And without that flow of information, the basic processes of any modern military, even if you're deployed in a faraway land that's really dusty, grinds to a halt. You can't get the information that you need to discern between friend and foe. You can't figure out what the foe is trying to do. You can't even tell your own people where to go, what actions to take. You're all well aware of examples, and I think, Raf, you're going to mention them, of a small country far away that saw arguably a penultimate threat to its existence emerging, and without using direct kinetic action, managed to shut down a very significant facility. It's going to happen more and more often, but it won't only happen over there. Think of the capital flight issue as a result of 9/11. The loss of life was tragic. The amount of capital, the depreciation in the various markets that happened on that fateful day was not in the hundreds of billions, but arguably just short of $1 trillion in value that disappeared. You don't think about it at the time you're trying to collect the wounded or clear up the rubble. But the loss of confidence to a nation, should such an act happen without the catastrophic climatic collapse of towers, would probably be enough to send our economies in their fragile state over the edge. If we were to fail in a battle group attack in Afghanistan, we could result probably in multiple casualties in the 15, 20s, 100s. But it would be a relatively isolated act. A penetration, active penetration and exploitation of information from one of our major chartered banks, which was then published on the internet, could result in such a lack of consumer flight from an economy which prides itself on its regulatory mechanisms that you're talking essentially fiscally catastrophic results, all of which contribute to the security of a nation. So if part of D&D CF's remit is security, and cyber is very much seen as the threat area, the one that's most likely to occur, it behooves D&D and the CF to spend more resources not only defending themselves, but getting more closely wired with corporate Canada and the other key players so they can do a better job. What regulatory mechanisms exist currently in terms of the information reporting if you have a significant penetration of an investment firm, in terms of information being essentially poached or pirated? Does anybody know? Anybody? Of course, the answer is none. So we're building capability, we're building doctrine, we're building the people skills required, we're getting more closely aligned with industry, A variety of nascent government organizations are struggling to bring this all together, and yet there's no legislative basis for us to take the next step. The same is true down in the United States. You're aware of what happened with President Obama's recent effort to come up with a cyber policy. It was defeated. Now, theirs was a lot more draconian than perhaps ours could have been, but it was still defeated. Why? What is this reluctance? And what sort of influence does that have on a national security posture for cyber? That brings me to the final point in my, 1 minute remaining. We, as taxpayers, are going to expect the CF and D&D to invest more heavily in cyber. Another growth area is space. To do so, they're going to have to find the resources from within. Now, that is eminently possible. There are literally thousands of people in CF and D&D who work in the IT domain, and there's multiple hundreds who are actively involved in cyber defense. But I can tell you right now, it's not enough, because the threats literally multiply faster than any of us can count. So what are we going to do about it? And the question, or the answer arguably, is more awareness, more attention to the issues that are going on, and a bunch of very pointed questions to D&D and the CF. Okay, where are you actually spending our tax dollars? Why have your staffs non-deployable in Ottawa grown to a modest sum of close to 24,000 now in the National Capital Region? Why is it you've only got a couple hundred folk dedicated to Cyber Command? Good idea. It's a good start anyways, but don't stop there. Last point. Cyber is arguably the battlefield of the future. Having said all that, and taken my slight rant to one side, don't throw out the existing capabilities that we're going to need again. It's a very fine choice, a discerning choice between the technologies and the capabilities you have now, throwing them out to make way for the new. So my plea to any and all who will listen is, don't get rid of teeth, because eventually you'll need to bite something. Get rid of tail. Tail's overhead. Just like corporate Canada has been doing for the last couple of years. Talked to most of the charter banks in a former life. They are reducing the size of their overhead and offices to invest, of course, in those frontline services and in their cyber defense mechanisms. Something that we should be doing as well. So, quick summation. The past, where we were before the latest Afghan war. What happened essentially at the end of the 2010 period when we moved from the combat or the kinetic activities in Kandahar up to the more benign training mission in Kabul. The idea of change or transformation as it applies to cyber, and arguably what's next in terms of a legislative framework. With that, I will turn it over to, I've forgotten who, is it Raf? I will be quiet and she will tell me what to do.
Thank you, General Leslie, for a very engaging presentation.